Hey team. All right, so let's jump into what we're doing today. You don't have any extra homework tonight, no reading pages, no nothing. So once you finish what we're doing in class, you are done with ELA for the day. So let's dive in. So today we're going to be reading about Jim Crow laws and how they have influenced America. If you don't know what those are, we're going to do an overview for you. You maybe have heard about them before. If you have, that's great. But we're going to be reading about them. All right, so let's dive into it. So, Jim Crow laws are laws that enforced racial segregation, right? So, they kept people who were Black away from people who were white. So, they were put in place in, the 40s, 50s, 60s, especially in the South. And the whole point of those laws was to take away the political and economic improvement made by Black citizens. Okay. So I want to be super, super clear here. These laws were constructed on purpose to inhibit, oppress, and keep down Black citizens of the United States. This was not a mistake. This was not well intentioned. The people in power put the white people in power, let's be really clear, the white dudes in power, put these laws in place specifically to keep the Black population of this country from gaining things politically, gaining a voice, gaining, economic stuff, being able to buy houses, to pay off debt, to go to school, right? So I want to be super, super clear that these laws were on purpose. They were in place until 1965 when they were struck down as unconstitutional. So some examples of these types of laws would be interracial marriage being illegal. There were white sections of a restaurant or a swimming pool or bathrooms in a building. And Black people could not be served in the white sections, like they would be straight up ignored. There were separate schools, swimming pools, public places, parks for Black citizens and white citizens. And any public building was divided and separated. So, for instance, like in the DMV, when getting your driver's license, there would be a section where all of the Black folks had to congregate. They were not allowed to just kind of like walk around and get what they wanted. They had to use separate bathrooms. So it was like really a thing. It was very pervasive. It was everywhere. So one of the things that came out of Jim Crow is our current prison system. So let's talk about how that happened. So basically, since the white folks came here and decided to kill all the indigenous Americans, we have been guided by a racial hierarchy system. Okay. And within that, there's like some gender stuff, but pretty much anybody who's not white is not on the highest level of the hierarchy. They will not be able to reach that, right? So even in places that are pretty integrated, we still have a really deep, many things are deeply rooted in this system. Okay. So just tracing that out for Black people who came to this country, it started obviously with slavery, right? Black people being taken from their homes in Africa, shipped over here, made to work, owned as property. Then we got into Jim Crow laws, which were another version of the same thing, right? A way to enslave and keep down Black members of our country. And currently, this is taking the shape of mass incarceration, right? Prison. So when you look at the stats, there are way more folks of color and African American folks who are in prison than white people. And it's awful. So when we're talking about this racial hierarchy, basically we keep using that racial hierarchy, right, to reinvent the systems, right? So white people in power keep kind of inventing new systems in order to keep down anyone who's not a white person, depending on what's acceptable and what's not in that era, right? So in the modern world, right, we like to think that slavery is unacceptable. It definitely still happens in a lot of places, but we like to think that, and that's why the mass incarceration, the prison system, is such a big deal. It's just another form of that. Okay. All right. So, in the same way that slavery is a way to control certain races, Jim Crow was a way to control certain races, the prison system is too. And one of the biggest things about this is the war on drugs, right? So, I want to be really clear here. It is not an equal war on all drugs. What it is set up to make the prison sentences for Black folks and any drug use harsher than they are for white folks, right? So the war on drugs does not apply equally to white people. Their punishments are much less severe. And the way that happens is it also is not applied to all drugs equally. So, for instance, punishments for drugs that are in higher use in Black and people of color communities, those have harsher sentences than a designer drug or kind of a classier, more expensive drug or a prescription drug that might be more prevalent in a white community. All right. So, for example, the sentences for crack are actually more severe than the sentences for cocaine, even though they're the same drug. The sentence crack is primarily used in low-income neighborhoods and Black communities because it's cheaper, it's easier to access. Cocaine is like the higher end version of that same drug, and it's often used by a predominantly white population of folks. Okay, so that was a ton of information, but basically we want to give you all of this background because we want it to help you really understand what we're about to read. Okay, so just like we were saying before, because these laws are different, right, and they don't apply equally to the different types of drugs or to the people who are being sentenced, the amount of Black folks who are considered criminals, who are incarcerated, who have even had charges brought against them and dropped, is much, much, much higher than the rate of white folks. And you guys know if you're convicted of a crime, you do time, whatever, you have certain rights stripped away, right? So Jim Crow was a way to strip away rights, and so is the prison system. So we're going to read an excerpt from a book called The New Jim Crow. The author is named Michelle Alexander, and she shows how the prison system and the war on drugs are another version of the Jim Crow laws. They're a way to preserve white privilege and power and oppress people of color, especially Black folks. So let's jump into it. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I am going to read a pretty good portion. So you should be looking for 2.6 New Jim Crow in your iLearn. And I'm going to read up until kind of this first question. And then you're going to need to do the rest on your own. Okay, so remember this is just a small part of a bigger book. And if you're interested, the book is amazing. I think that's a great thing to read. Okay, let's get started. In October 1982, President Reagan officially announced his administration's war on drugs. At the time he declared this new war, less than 2% of the American public viewed drugs as the most important issue facing the nation. This fact was no deterrent to Reagan, for the drug war from the outset had little to do with public concern about drugs and much to do with public concern about race. By waging a war on drug users and dealers, Reagan made good on his promise to crack down on the racially defined others, the undeserving. Practically overnight, the budgets of federal law enforcement agencies soared. Between 1980 and 1984, The FBI anti-drug funding increased from $8 million to $95 million. Department of Defense anti-drug allocations decreased from $33 million in 1981 to $1,042 million in 1991. During that same period, the DEA anti-drug spending grew from 86 to 1,206 million, and the FBI anti-drug allocations grew from 38 to 181 million. 38 million. By contrast, funding for agencies responsible for drug treatment, prevention, and education was dramatically reduced. The budget of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, for example, was reduced from $274 million to $57 million from 1981 to 1984, and anti-drug funds allocated in the Department of Education were cut from $14 million to $3 million. Determined to ensure that the new Republican majority would continue to support the extraordinary expansion of the federal government's law enforcement activities and, that Congress would continue to fund it, the Reagan administration launched a media offensive to justify the war on drugs. Central to the media campaign was an effort to sensationalize the emergence of crack cocaine in inner-city neighborhoods, communities that were devastated by industrialization and skyrocketing unemployment. The media frenzy the campaign inspired simply could not have come at a worse time for African Americans. In the early 1980s, just as the drug war was kicking off, inner-city communities were suffering from economic collapse. The blue-collar factory jobs that had been plentiful in urban areas in the 1950s and the 1960s had suddenly disappeared. The new manufacturing jobs that opened up during this time period were generally located in the suburbs. The growing spatial mismatch of jobs had a profound impact on African Americans trapped in ghettos. The decline in legitimate employment opportunities among inner-city residents increased incentives to sell drugs, most notably crack cocaine. Crack hit the streets in 1985, a few years after Reagan's drug war was announced, leading to a spike in violence in drug markets struggled to stabilize, and the anger and frustration associated with joblessness boiled. Joblessness and crack swept inner-city cities precisely at the moment that a fierce backlash against the civil rights movement was manifesting itself through the war on drugs. Numerous paths were available to us as a nation in the wake of the crack crisis. Yet for reasons traceable largely to racial politics and fear-mongering, we chose war. Conservatives found that they could finally justify an all-out war on an enemy that had been racially defined years before. Okay, so let's pause there and do our first question. So, what is the war on drugs really about? And once you get that answered, you can continue on your own. Let me know if you have questions. I know this is kind of dense and it's a lot, so if you need to, take breaks.